making a band album, certainly a Fleetwood Mac album, you could always make the analogy to, say, movie making. If I had to choose the one contribution to that group that I would consider my most important, it wouldn't be as guitarist or a singer or writer, it would be as someone who could take raw material and fashion it into a sound. So in making the analogy to movie making with a group, it's sort of like, you know, having a script and a small group of characters and directing a film. Certainly, it's a more political process, and in a way, sort of a more chaotic thing. You don't know what it means to win, oh no. So come down and see me again, yes, yes. Solo work, really, you can make the analogy to painting. I've been down one time, I've been down 2 times, I've been down 3 times. You may start off with a certain intent, you may think you have the song written, and as you start slopping these colors on the canvas, if you're doing it properly, the canvas will take on a life of its own and start to lead you off in directions you would never have expected to go. When I think of my tenure with the band, I would certainly like to think that I was doing the right thing for myself and for everyone else, and I mean, being a team player. I was very lucky to have a very close first-hand view during, say, the Rumours time with Fleetwood Mac, where I could observe a mega level of success and see that it was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're getting notoriety, you're getting a certain freedom to be able to create, you're certainly getting financial benefits. The other side of that is that there's a lot of machinery that gears up behind that kind of a situation. And that machinery would like you to repeat yourself over and over again and to follow that adage, if it works, run it into the ground. I think the more you do that over and over, the more sort of soul-deadening it can be. It forced me to look at why I got into this in the first place, and it was to hopefully, you know, define myself to some degree through my work, to grow through my work as a person, try to make it an experience which represents having learned something in the process. And I think you're going to find that you have a lot more longevity that way, and certainly, you know, a lot more honesty. It's interesting, I think that somewhere in the making of the first Fleetwood Mac album that I was involved with, there was a really strong sense that something special was going on. So I don't think anyone was that surprised when it hit. So Afraid, that's a great example of what Fleetwood Mac was in the studio versus on stage, because that was a conceptual song with, in a sense, a lot less power, and then we got it to the stage and it turned into a pit bull. You know, that was one of the great things about Fleetwood Mac, was we could just get out there and you know, retranslate the whole approach from what it was on the record. Maybe Rumours was a little more of a surprise, because it's one thing to sell, you know, 2 million albums. It's another thing to sell the most albums that had ever been sold up to that time. The Rumours album really, you know, you talk about the music, but then beyond that, people talk about the success, or they talk about the, quote, musical soap opera. Because John and Christine were breaking up, because Stevie and I were breaking up during the making of that album, that you find a lot of cross conversations going on, and very honest ones. In fact, just about everything on Rumours had to do with that, certainly. And I think that struck a chord with people. When something elevates to that level, it really has as much to do with the audience as it has to do with the band. And it was strange. It's hard not to be sort of ambivalent about that, because at some point the phenomenon of Rumours became the focus, not the music. And it sort of leaves you out on a limb. Where do you go from there? Do you try to make Rumours too, which the machinery would dictate that you do? And even if you do try, will you be able to? Probably not. You know, that was a moment. So why try? You know, we confounded the audience, certainly, with Tusk as a follow-up. But it was certainly a way to undercut any preconceptions they might have had. And, you know, it was an odd time. It was kind of a crazy time. The Tusk idea started, again, with me reacting to not only the success of Rumours and seeing it as maybe a double-edged sword, but also the process in which I was recording with the band. If you go back to what I was doing before Fleetwood Mac, there certainly was more of this kind of musical painting going on, which I had totally let go of. I was interested in reclaiming some of that because it was, of all the things that might have been given up, that was the one thing which I felt had left a huge space in terms of my musical functioning. As you're going to feel about this, but I would like to go do some of my writing / recording on my own at home, and then bring the stuff in and have everyone react to it and work on it, and also then get involved with everyone else's songs. And that was not well received at first, but it was received, and I did do that. When it became clear it wasn't going to repeat the success in terms of sales, there was sort of a backlash from within the group saying, well, you know, you're not going to do that again. It's a very fine line, you know, between being experimental and being accessible. It's not easy at all. It's something which has to be done with a certain amount of finesse. Tusk is actually my favorite album of the Fleetwood Mac involvement, not only because it represents sort of the embarkation on a certain kind of level of thinking about what's important and what isn't, but just the music itself. It's joyful and it's explosive, and it was a moment, certainly for me. But, you know, I sort of overestimated not the public's ability, but maybe their willingness to take such a left turn so quickly. I think if you want to keep an audience going with you over a period of time, you've got to do it gradually. The idea to do Law and Order, the first solo project, it was partially a reaction to the idea that, you know, that experimental side that was pursued on the Tusk album was being blocked from being pursued within the group. That was part of it, and there was no other way to do it. But the other side, too, is just that, you know, in a group where there are 5 very strong personalities, which can make for some tension, that, you know, there needs to be a safety valve sometimes. And I think not just for me, but for other members who pursued solo albums, that was a way to just let off steam. Law and Order did yield one big hit, Trouble, but it never really drove the point home to the point where I thought that I should be leaving the group. There was too much going on, and when I did leave the group, I only left when I felt it was sort of, quote, karmically correct to do so, where it wasn't going to be hurtful, and there were a lot of loose ends tied up. So 81 was too early. By the time we got to Mirage, in my mind, we were already sort of cut loose from the essence of what we were about, and were sort of, I felt like I was sort of adrift a little bit. By the time we got to the Go Insane album, I mean, things were kind of strapo by then. Personal life was a little tough. And again, you know, the band was really starting to split apart in many ways. And I think that album really reflected sort of a dark side of what was going on, and also really reflected the idea of a lot of structures breaking down. I mean, if you look at Go Insane, it starts off with pop songs, and as it moves from one song to the other, it slowly turns into something a little more bizarre, which was an effect that was calculated. Between my material and the band material by '87 had gotten a little fuzzy. I guess you could say to some degree there are aspects of the Tusk approach in Tango in the Night, even though it's in a different way. It's in a less raw way. You can find certain pieces that definitely are not Fleetwood Mac songs, and you can find certain pieces that definitely are. And there are always going to be some gray in the middle that could go either way, and I think Big Love is probably one of those. Right before Tango in the Night, you know, I was working on what would have been a third solo record, and I hadn't really defined it in my mind that I was near the end at that point with Fleetwood Mac. I think it really was only when I was sort of forced to make a choice in terms of how I was going to involve myself with the Tango in the Night album, between being peripherally involved, you know, working on my solo work and then going in and doing guitar parts and then bringing in cameo producers or something like that. When I thought about it in those terms, I realized that was probably going to be the last thing I would do with them. In my opinion, it was not a very creative atmosphere anymore. If you look at the other solo records, certainly those were valid points of reference for me, and they certainly did the job they were supposed to do, I think. But you have to qualify that to some degree, and again, think about the fact that they were both done under a certain amount of duress, under fairly, you know, small time frames. They certainly did the job in terms of me defining myself as something other than what I was in Fleetwood Mac and setting the stage for what I'm doing now. Once I had a handle on the kind of album I wanted to make, I started working. You know, I'd let the emotional dust settle from that 12-year stint with Fleetwood Mac, and then I, you know, began work on Out of the Cradle, which took about 3 years. I'm waiting on the countdown. I will say that Out of the Cradle, I think it certainly represents a broader range of emotion than I was able to come up with on solo records, or was maybe called upon to come up with in the band. It's very strong and optimistic about things to come, and but only by virtue of having lost some baggage and been able to sort of, through hindsight, gain a little wisdom and understanding about the past. I try to write about what I know, as they say you should do, and a lot of observations or emotional stances that may be specifically about something that has happened to me, but I try to keep them slightly enigmatic in the sense that they aren't so specific that people couldn't, you know, relate them to whatever their situation might be. I'm very skeptical of trying to define what a lyric may be specifically for me, because it might rob someone else of a different meaning. An example of that might be, there's a song called Wrong, sort of a slap on the hand of the generic rock types who tend to lose their perspective and act inappropriately because of it. Looking through the keyhole. And I've heard people ask me if that's about George Bush. I think the Fleetwood Mac shows had gotten to a point where the politics dictated there was very little that you could do that was new. You could throw in some new tunes, but you really couldn't try anything too different. I feel as though Fleetwood Mac in many ways was like my thesis work. And this particular work is very much on my own terms, but it's also kind of a reconciliation between what were two sides of myself, and I think that's a very important part of this record. In order to know where you're going, you have to be able to visualize it a little bit. If you can't get an idea of what you're moving towards, you know, you're not going to know which direction to go. I think the same gift of being able to visualize music as seeing it, you know, and then try to get to it, is very similar to thinking about where you want to go and move towards that. I'm a soul drifting and I'm out of this town. Ain't no use hanging around, you see. I have a lot more that I need to get out and a lot more ideas that are kicking around, and I think I would be irresponsible to my gifts not to pursue them. It's all tied into just fulfilling yourself and to growing, hopefully. And if you sell a few million albums along the way, great. You see, it's a new dawn, so it's so long for the soul lifter, the soul drifter. That's me. That's me. That's me.